Hi guys, LoreLord here. Sorry about the late upload. And before I start the topic of today's video, I just want to take a moment to appreciate 300 subscribers. Well, we're a bit over that now, but still, 300. That is honestly incredible, especially considering how I only started this channel about a bit less than 2 years ago. I knew I'd probably have a lot of subscribers by now, but not this many. This is literally what I would consider unironically based. So seriously, thank you guys. So now let's begin the topic of today's video, which is my character's build. For those who may not be aware or don't really understand the definition of a Skyrim build, builds are sets of equipment, skills, etc. that players use to build their characters for the specific playstyle that they wish to play. For example, if you want to use archery as your primary form of combat in Skyrim, you may use an archery build. And since these are role-playing games that builds refer to, builds can also be a part of role-playing. For example, you may use a build that suits best with a specific faction member. You can even take the role-playing feature to another level.
That's what she said!
By giving the character of a specific build a backstory. If you search up Skyrim builds on YouTube, you can find many examples of this. So these are the topics that I will be mentioning about my build in today's video. I'll start by briefly going over a few terms that need to be understood so that my build can be understood. Then I'll go over the traits of my build, and then finally, the backstory. And so this is the build that I usually play as when I play Skyrim, the Nordic Halberdier. So here are a few things that we need to know in order to understand the build. So first of all, what is a halberdier? A halberdier was a specific type of soldier in the medieval times, particularly the 14th to 16th century, that used a weapon known as the halberd, which was a two-handed pole weapon with an axe blade top. Halberds can still be seen being used by the Swiss Guard in the Vatican City today, but now that we know that, the name Nordic Halberdier may seem to be an oxymoron, because the Nords of Skyrim, especially when it comes to their fighting techniques, were inspired from the Vikings, who never used halberds, because they were only really used in the late medieval period. And therefore, yes, to say that Nordic Halberdier is an oxymoron would be partially correct. But an interesting thing about this build is that when you consider both the weapons used and the Viking-style fighting techniques used, you can somewhat get an idea of how Vikings would use halberds if they did. The next on the list are the specific fighting techniques that would be used by this build, and the specific skills and traits that you should prioritize on if you wish to use this build, or at least a build similar to this. The race would be Nord.
Well, no fucking shit!
Both because the Nord race has a lot of traits that are beneficial for this build, and also because of the build's character and backstory. Now we'll go over to skills and the Guardian signs. This is hardly a magic-based build, so there's really only two forms of magic that this build uses: all the shouts and restoration. Because of this, the only skill you really need to worry about under the mage sign is restoration. But in the warrior sign, it is a very different story. In fact, if you wish to use this build, you should prioritize in all skills underneath the warrior sign. 4 of those skills may be obvious: heavy armor and block, because this build acts as a hold the line kind of fighter, similar to how real halberdiers and spearmen were used in medieval times. Two-handed, because the player uses two-handed battle axes. This one definitely goes without saying. And smithing, to forge better armor and two-handed weapons. But you may be wondering on why one-handed and archery. The reason why is that although this build almost always uses two-handed weapons, battle axes to be specific, he does have both a one-handed sword and a crossbow that he can quickly switch to if he must. And finally, the Thief Guardian sign. None of these are a real necessity for this build, Personally, when I play under this build, which I usually do, under the thief sign I usually focus on speech, but that's mostly for role-playing purposes. And as we know, when you level up, you can choose to either raise your health, stamina, and magicka. The best order to do this, which I always do, is to do health twice in a row, because health is vital for this specific build, and then stamina, because that is also very important, and then magicka, because that is not so much. Or you could even do stamina again before doing magicka. But what's important is that you prioritize health over stamina, which you then prioritize over magicka. As for armor, any heavy armor will technically do, but for role-playing purposes, I'd recommend some sort of Nordic stylish set of armor. And weapons, starting off with the primary weapon. Technically, you can use any two-handed weapon, but to truly live up to the term Nordic Halberdier, the best thing to use would be a battle axe. Your secondary would be a one-handed sword. This wouldn't be often used, but can be if you must. And for archery, although bows can technically work, crossbows work with this build much, much better. That said, this is a weapon that is also rarely used. And so those are all the traits and equipment that work best with this specific build. And now, to end off today's video, the backstory of the Nordic Halberdier, which is my personal favourite part about Skyrim builds. The Nordic Halberdier was born in the year 4th era 160 in the city of Windhelm, to a Nordic father, a proud Nordic warrior who used similar fighting techniques that the Halberdier would later use, and an imperial mother who moved to Skyrim after previously living in the Cyrodiilic city of Bruma, nearby to the Skyrim border. At around 4th era 170, his father, who wanted to train his son to become a warrior, decided that he was now old enough to start learning. Therefore, the Halberdier started learning the fighting techniques that his father used, but he also learned two very vital life lessons from his father. The first one, the world will always be filled with evil that wants to take from you. You must be prepared to defend what is yours. And second, you are not the only one with wants and needs. When something belongs to another man, you are to respect that, and also to help them defend what is theirs when they are in need. Basically, what these two life lessons mean is that you should be prepared to defend both yourself and the good in the world from the evil in the world. And these two life lessons would prove to be very, very valuable a mere year later, because a year later would be the beginning of the Great War. The Halberdier's father went to fight alongside Ulfric Stormcloak and his militia, but before he left, the Halberdier promised to continue with his lessons. It was only after the Great War that the Halberdier, who was now 15, learnt that his father was killed in combat. At this point, the Halberdier's mother, for obvious reasons, was filled with grief, but the Halberdier himself, he learnt from his father to turn his grief into anger, and because of this, he had a strong enough reason to continue his training, despite no longer having his mentor. Both he and his mother moved to Burma in Cyrodiil with his mother's parents, both because his mother needed parental aid with struggling with the loss, and also for financial reasons, as the family had lost its provider. The Nordic Halberdier continued to train for the next 3 years, until the age of 18, and ready to use his combat knowledge to action. Against the wishes of his mother and grandparents, the Nordic Halberdier went to Hammerfell to aid the Red Guards in resistance against the Dominion. The Nordic Halberdier wanted a reason to fight against the Thalmor. But the reason why wasn't simply out of revenge for his father, but because the Thalmor was the very evil that his father taught him to resist. In 4th era 180, the Dominion pulled out of Hammerfell, and the Nordic Halberdier left Hammerfell and returned to Cyrodiil, except he didn't stay there for long. Skyrim was always more of a home to him than Cyrodiil, and therefore sometime later he left Cyrodiil to return to Skyrim, where he worked as a mercenary. As a mercenary, however, he would only take jobs that were given to him by the law against breakers of the law, such as bandits, because no amount of septims could ever convince the Nordic Halberdier to break his moral code. He stayed in Skyrim until the civil war there started, which was about several years before the death of Torrig. The Nordic Halberdier wanted to side with the Stormcloaks for two reasons. One, the Imperials were now puppets of the Thalmor, which he hated, and two, it would give him the opportunity to fight alongside the same commander that his father did, Ulfric Stormcloak. Before he did, however, he thought he would make one last visit to his mother in Cyrodiil, and by the way, whilst living in Skyrim, he did visit his mother occasionally. His grandparents had passed by this stage, which he was already aware of, but what the Nordic Halberdier didn't know was that his mother was also starting to become ill. He only realised this during this one last visit, before the Civil War. The Halberdier was planning on making this a quick few-month visit, but knowing that his mother would need him during the last years of her life, he stayed with her until she passed, which was in the year 4th era, 201. After his mother's funeral, the Nordic Halberdier made his way back to Skyrim, but in the Pale Pass at the border, Ulfric and some of his Stormcloaks were ambushed by legionaries, who found the Nordic Halberdier at the Pale Pass and arrested him, ironically mistaking him for someone who had already joined the Stormcloak cause. And the rest is history. And so that is the Nordic Halberdier. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and you like the idea of this build, and I will see you guys in the next one.